Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. Wyll, as I'm guessing most of you know, is easily one of the most disliked and controversial companions in all of Baldur's Gate 3. Hell, even the idea for this video came from the numerous comments I've got, joking or not, about the great distaste for Wyll's character. And you know, I get it, and I didn't exactly rank him very high in my companion ranking video that I did a while back. However, I do still think there is more to Wyll's character than most people let on. So today I want to discuss all of this with you and break down the truth of Wyll's character. Also quickly, if you enjoy this type of content, please consider subbing to the channel and dropping a like. And without further ado, let's get right into it. Before we get into the discussion of why I believe Wyll is a better character than most people understand, I think it's a great idea to dissect exactly why he's quote-unquote hated. Starting with the very introduction of Wyll's character, there is definitely a certain irony in how he arrives in his first scene in front of the Emerald Grove. He lands himself right onto the high ground of the battlefield, seemingly confident and prepared, giving us an impression of a character filled with the notions of justice and morality. But really, it didn't take long for many of us, including myself, to discount him simply as the textbook example of a fantasy hero, one that was innately too polished and predictable. And in a game where many companions have their own distinct moral dilemmas and complexities, Wyll's sense of polish definitely becomes a flaw. To me, it's for this very reason as to why Wyll has gained the title of boring amongst the wider Baldur's Gate 3 community, and in many ways he is. One of the biggest critiques I've seen over and over again regarding Wyll's character is that he lacks the internal conflicts that make the other companions, such as Shadowheart and Astarion, really shine. To many, it seems like Wyll rarely initiates any sort of drama or conflict with others or within himself, and instead he just reacts and sometimes even becomes a passive observer in his own story. And really, I think this is the issue with his character, where for other companions in their most critical moments they come to a decision with you, the player. Most of Wyll's character moments feel like we are just making the choices for him. Let's take the example of deciding between his pact and his father. In what is easily the climax of Wyll's character arc in the game, it simply boils down to a decision that you can simply select, and it never feels like Wyll has any input of his own. This is particularly jarring in a game where many other companions retain their agency, especially in critical moments for their character, but unfortunately Wyll lacks any true agency of his own. This sort of passiveness in the defining moments of his character are without a doubt to me the greatest letdown of his character as a whole. But even beyond the lack of choices and identity Wyll highlights throughout his arc, another clear problem with his character that many bring up is simply the lack of content in his quest. And I think this is an issue that really no one can deny. Again, in comparison to many of the other companions in the game who have rich and branching arcs, both in their personal quests and romance arcs, Wyll comparatively seems like he has little room to breathe. He shows up in fewer cutscenes, has fewer dialogue, and he overall has less dramatic payoffs than the other Origin companions in the game. Of course, this is a major issue as it gives Wyll much fewer opportunities to develop beyond the facade of his character that has been built up over the course of the game. And this great imbalance with his character's content and scenes isn't simply anecdotal, but in many ways is baked into the very structure of the game itself. Once again, bringing up the choice surrounding his pact with Mazora, Wyll has no real dialogue to relay his own thoughts on the matter, and the entirety of his personal agency is replaced by us in the climax of his very own story. What I think compounds this is the fact that Wyll's character was completely rewritten and overhauled before the game's release, which can definitely be felt, and to me could explain why his conflicts within the game feel so softened. Where potentially before Wyll may have had more introspection of his own, sharper stakes, and more internal struggles, the final version of his character often feels more sanitized and emotionally dry. And so I really do get the community's sentiment on his character, and I think that the character we got in the game is really a shell of what could have been, which is something I'll discuss in a later section of this video. But despite everything we just discussed, I believe that Wyll's sense of morality, combined with the devilish nature of his pact, gives him more substance than most people initially realize, because beneath his polished exterior is a constant moral and personal tug of war between the man Wyll wants to be and the forces that keep rewriting who he has to be. As mentioned earlier in the video, when you first meet Wyll in Baldur's Gate 3, he seems to embody everything a high fantasy hero is supposed to be. He strides in with confidence and conviction, calling himself the Blade of Frontiers, a supposed champion of the ordinary people who hunts devils and defends the innocent. His introduction is undoubtedly steeped in the polish of his noble background and the promise of justice for all. But looking further into it, that polished hero facade is actually part of the problem with Wyll's character. Because in a game full of complicated, almost tortured characters, challenges, Wyll initially does feel too safe. He does fit the classic archetype of a hero with a cause and purpose, and on paper, he's exactly what you'd expect from an ordinary fantasy hero. But what makes him so by the book is also exactly what draws scrutiny to his character. That archetype of the clean hero is one that we measure by established standards. Does Wyll truly fight the good fight? Does he remain true in the face of temptation? In Wyll's case, it's clear that these standards are tested by layers of his hidden conflicts, because beneath the lie of his identity as a hero lies a warlock pact with an infernal patron, Mazora, who manipulates Wyll and demands absolute obedience while holding his soul in bondage. It is this very pact that complicates the fantasy hero archetype in Wyll's story. On one level, Wyll does want to be a hero, but on another, his power comes from a source that demands his subservience. It's of course the classic deal with the devil trope, with his noble intentions being overshadowed by the hidden costs of his warlock powers. This conflict is what sets him apart, as what appears to be the straightforward fantasy hero is actually a character bound by compromise, personal guilt, and external pressures. And because Wyll leans so heavily into the usual heroic tropes, many players, including myself, will initially accept him without a word, seeing him as the kind of hero we'd want in our party. In many ways, Wyll does perfectly fit this role in the party, and some of the builds people online have come up for him do really lean into reflecting his identity as a self-proclaimed Blade of Frontiers. And yet to me, this is where the tension of the archetype he fits starts to become a double-edged sword. It's undeniable that Wyll fits the mold so perfectly that when the story needs him to break out and change, the failure to do so becomes much more obvious. This is simply because a perfect hero in a story with interesting and morally complex companions is naturally going to be judged much more harshly. The expectations on Wyll were always going to be high, and both me and you expected him to always be in this space of moral purity and always in control of his own actions. But again, coming back to his pact, it doesn't allow for him to always be free to choose, and that contrast between the archetypical hero he wants to be and the captive warlock he is central to his identity throughout the game. To me, this tension isn't just thematic, but it's something that shows up both narratively and mechanically. To the world, Wyll does live up to his name and reputation as a champion of the people, but to us, we eventually see behind the curtain and see that the facade of his character hides a cursed depth. Again, I'd like to have a look at the way that Wyll's companion quest is structured. He's introduced to us as a celebrated monster hunter, but as you progress, he slowly reveals his hidden debt and conflicts. He has various moments where he must choose between fulfilling his pact or following his conscience, but these choices are constrained by the very nature of his pact itself, and it is this very restriction that leads to the climactic decision in Act 3 where Wyll has to choose whether to stay bound in his pact and save his father or break it and risk his father's life. Although we ultimately have the reins in choosing how this goes, the forceful dichotomy of the decision highlights how the hero archetype Wyll embodies is challenged by real stakes and hidden moral costs. I think we can all agree that this clash is what makes his heroism all the more tragic, because he isn't just the hero in shining armor, but he fights with shackles on his very soul. And to me, that does make him much more interesting than the archetype alone might suggest. The story of Baldur's Gate 3 uses this archetype as bait, as it makes you think that you know him and can understand him, but then it reveals hidden layers to his character, ones that reflect deep sacrifice and guilt. From our perspective, there's almost a moment of cognitive dissonance in whether Wyll is truly heroic because he chooses to be, or whether he's heroic because the pact forces him to. Of course, this question immediately unsettles the archetype, as you'd honestly expect that a hero is supposed to act from their free will, but as we know, Wyll acts in part because he has no choice not to. And in many ways, this undermines the simplicity of the stereotype he's supposed to fit into, and creates true complexity for his character. But the very conflict of Wyll's character is also what gives him great potential, because when you peel back the layers of his facade as a typical hero, he becomes someone fighting for freedom, redemption, and against forces far greater than himself. Honestly, the archetype we associate with Wyll as the boring hero is really just the surface of his character, as underneath all of it, he is a hero shaped by his constraints and shaped by his sacrifices and guilt. So when we finally help break his pact or choose to keep it, even knowing what it will cost him, the image we have of him transforms into something much deeper and eventually much more tragic. It is in this very transformation that the hero we thought we knew turns into something else entirely. Not a symbol, but a person who is trying to hold on to hope in a world that keeps testing it. Ultimately, Wyll's persona of being the typical fantasy hero in many ways becomes both his mask and his prison. I often find it quite haunting to think about just how much cut content Baldur's Gate 3 has. But if there's any companion who was most affected by the game's abundance of cut content, it's definitely Wyll himself. Many layers of Wyll's original story simply never made the cut, and it often makes me wonder about how the Wyll we know in the final game is simply a fractured version of what might have been. Data mined content and early access versions of the game reveal a great amount of content for Wyll that we never get to see in any form in the final release of the game. Data miners have found entire quests, alternative dialogues, and even unique areas tied to Wyll specifically that were just cut or left unimplemented. One specific finding that I found super interesting is that Wyll was supposed to have a unique area called the Red War College, which would be a location that would have tied directly into his backstory and would have possibly expanded his personal arc in the game. Of course, this location is not seen anywhere in the final version of Baldur's Gate 3. What's actually interesting about this cut content specifically is that Larian CEO Sven even commented on it last year, noting that Wyll was indeed supposed to have a big moment set at a war college, but this was of course cut. To be honest, this is quite sad, as that war college scene could not have only been an incredible set piece in the game, but it could have wrestled with Wyll's dual identity as a hero more explicitly. But of course, this big moment is something that remains cut from the game, and something I don't think we'll unfortunately ever see. But even beyond missing locations, companion banter that would have fleshed out Wyll's relationships with other companions was also removed. Originally, Wyll was supposed to have more lines of banter with Lae'zel and Shadowheart, which would have revealed a more playful side of his personality. But again, these lines were unfortunately stripped from the final release, but this is something that modders have been able to restore in some form. This really just goes to show that much of Wyll's cut content was already recorded, or at the very least implemented in some form in earlier builds of the game, but nonetheless was still removed, most likely due to time constraints. Of course, these cuts aren't just superficial, but they in many ways are the very reason why Wyll's final quest arc feels so underdeveloped in comparison to all of the other Origin companions in the game. As I touched upon slightly earlier, the only major moment that Wyll has in Act 3 of the game is the decision surrounding Mazora's Pact, but even this becomes irrelevant when we make the decision for him. I honestly do think that the removal of a lot of his content is the reason why his arc lacks the emotional punch that companions like Shadowheart and Lae'zel have. Of course, all of this cut content also means that many of the choices or dialogue branches that are tied to Wyll are not fully fleshed out in the final release. Moving on from this, from more data mine content, it also appears that Wyll's entire background was changed as well. In earlier builds of the game, Wyll's background was different in that he was supposed to have a Blade of Frontiers custom background, but in the full release he uses the folk hero background. Of course, this may just be a minor change, but it again comes back to the idea that Wyll's version in the final game was a complete rewrite of what he was before. And really all of this adds up as scenes that were planned to deepen Wyll's motivations, expand his internal conflicts, and let us truly see beyond the mask he puts on were completely stripped or scaled down dramatically. Unfortunately, it's clear to me that this results in a Wyll that is a version trimmed for pacing or time issues, while lacking what could have made him more emotionally resonant for most players. Honestly, a hero whose fight with his infernal patron and his lineage through the cut war college scenes could have allowed Wyll to truly grow as a character and provide more substance for his arc overall. So when those scenes all vanish, so do the stakes of Wyll's arc altogether. The emotional weight of Wyll's struggles within the final version of the game are much lighter, and his choices aren't fully anchored in the sacrifices he had to make in his pact. Even in my first playthrough, I was confused at the conclusion of Wyll's arc, because to me it always felt like it never truly started. For a character whose entire arc is supposed to be built around the notions of devotion and sacrifice, losing the real substance of those beats dilutes the overall tragedy of his character. So really, without the war college scenes and the banter that would have shown his vulnerability amongst countless other scenes, Wyll feels like a hero whose story was cut in the middle of his journey. And I think you can also feel this when playing through Wyll's companion quest, because similarly to Karlach, Wyll doesn't get a satisfying ending or a truly big moment to mirror the conclusions of the other companions' arcs. He's simply left to the wayside as one of the game's most underdeveloped characters, and his choices consistently feel hollow or just outright unsatisfying. So now, when I look back at Wyll's journey, I always think of what could have been, and I see a companion whose arc had so much potential. He easily could have been one of the most tragic and intricately written characters in the entire game, but due to cut content and other issues, his potential simply remains locked away in the game's files. I know it's going to be an absolute huge task, but I really do hope that one day modders can slowly give us back the version of Wyll that was cut from the game. Like I mentioned earlier, the modding community has been ticking away at this gradually, as some of Wyll's banter lines, as I discussed earlier, have been restored in the game through mods. And hopefully this eventually results in being able to see even broken versions of the war college scenes, among other missing locations that would have added much needed substance to Wyll's overall companion quest. In many ways, all the cut content for Wyll we discussed today mirrors the very thing that his story was trying to say. Wyll's greatest curse was never his pact or the possible loss of his power, but it's the fact that he was never truly allowed to be who he was meant to become. So now when I think about Wyll, I don't just see an aspiring hero trapped by his infernal patron Mazora, but I see a character trapped by his circumstances, a ghost of his true potential, waiting quietly in the game's files for someone to set him free. And with all that said, that wraps up my discussion of Wyll as the quote-unquote most misunderstood character in Baldur's Gate 3. When I think about Wyll now, I don't just see the Blade of Frontiers or the so-called boring hero, but I see a character who was rewritten and cut down until only fragments of his true story remained. Beneath all of the missing quests and cut dialogue, Wyll is very much defined by the content that could have made him what we all wanted him to be. And maybe that's what makes Wyll's arc all the more haunting, because he was never boring, but simply never got the chance to truly evolve. Anyway, that's all from me for today's video. If you enjoyed, please consider subbing to the channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 and RPG content, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.